Okay, so good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on your location on our planet Earth. My name is Alon Tal. I'm a visiting professor at Stanford University, a visiting fellow as part of the Israel Studies program, and teaching at the Sustainability and Business program as well. I am delighted to serve as your moderator today in a very special and unique topic where we will be discussing Israel at war, social media, society, and misinformation. We have with us two most distinguished experts who will be sharing their experience, insights, and knowledge, and I will introduce them shortly. I would just sort of start with the notion that the problem of fake news and misinformation is nothing that is entirely new. Certainly for people who lived in Israel, there has been rumor mongering for years. Social media, however, has changed the dimensions and certainly the speed of this and the magnitude of this. And so when the war in Gaza and the October 7th massacre occurred, it did not take long. Almost immediately, there was massive amounts of information that was out there. Some of it was correct in retrospect, and some of it was false and not by coincidence. And I think that many people during the course of this ongoing conflict have been at a loss sometimes to know what's truth and what is fiction. Plenty of real imagery has been sent out there, but we've also had fictionalized accounts of hospitalizations and even Vladimir Putin has appeared with false videos. Old footage has been photoshopped onto new footage and with inaccurate representation. I myself, on October 18th, watched with many Israelis as the Israeli spokesman for the army delayed his response in regards to an attack on a hospital in Gaza. And there was some criticism because by the time he did respond, about 17, 18 hours with the official position, the narrative had already been established. What it turned out to be fake news, claiming that Israeli rockets had caused this damage, had already more or less become the dominant narrative in the Arab world. And indeed, in this case, there was massive geopolitical implications. President Biden was already on his way to Israel and had hoped to have a meeting with Arab leaders of moderate countries in Jordan. And as a result of this unfortunate event, in the end, those meetings never took place. And I think it was a setback for the moderate intervention. And so those are just some examples that we've seen here. And as we look to the continuing, how should I put it, hopefully resolution of this conflict, hopefully we can get smarter about how we as a public respond to fake news and misinformation, and how as a society we can protect ourselves. And to help us think about this in a more sophisticated and analytical way, we have two distinguished experts who will be joining us. And it is my pleasure now to introduce them. So Tomer Naor is the chief legal officer for the Movement for Quality Government in Israel. He describes himself first and foremost as a father, and I admire that, but also as a lawyer. He's a well-known social activist in Israel. He has a law degree from Hebrew University, and as a fellow graduate of that program, I salute him, and also a master's in law from Northwestern. And he's been with the Movement for Quality Government Israel, which is probably the leading NGO in Israel with regard to promoting good government within Israeli society. He's been there for 10 years, appearing often as an attorney in front of the Supreme Court, arguing key cases. And I would say also enjoying a bit of recognition on that, why the 2020 edition of the Marker magazine, which recognizes some of the movers and shakers in Israel in 2020, had him amongst his 40 under 40 influencers in Israel, and Tomer was recognized because of his important work. So he's worked with international media extensively over the past several years, and like I said, really is one of the faces of this critical public interest organization. And we're delighted to have you with us, Tomer, today.
Happy to be with you as well. Good evening.
And joining us as well is Omer Ben Jacob, or Ben Yaakov, if you're speaking to him in Israel. And he is the cyber and disinformation reporter for Haaretz. I was astonished to find that disinformation now was a significant enough phenomenon that Haaretz actually designates a position for that. And so really there's certainly nobody in the Israeli journalistic world who would know more about this topic than Omer. He covers this topic and has participated in many international investigations, chief amongst which was the Project Pegasus issue, where the NSO group in Israel was revealed as having maybe have a little bit of malfeasance. But he has been shortlisted for the European Press Awards, and his writing appears in Wikipedia, in Wired UK, Columbia Journalism Review, MIT Press, and other places. He lives in Jaffa and teaches in colleges in Israel, and is associated also with the Center for Research and Interdisciplinarity in Paris, which is a leading organization. So we're so delighted to have both of you with us, and thank you for sharing your insights. And I'm going to start the way this is going to work for our listeners. You should understand is that I will ask questions. We'll get brief answers from each. They can respond to each other and walk them through them. And after about 45 minutes, we will open it up to your questions, and hopefully we'll have a spirited discussion. And again, hopefully they'll be provocative, but we expect everybody, I'm speaking to participants, because I know that our speakers will be that way, to maintain strong civility and decency as we have an important discussion. So I'm going to start with you, if I might, Tomer. And I'd like to ask you, you were in Israel, I assume, on October 7th, when Hamas launched its horrific attacks in the Gaza envelope region. What happened after that? What is your understanding of the shifts in the media and in society in general in terms of reporting? Can we see this as a watershed date, or give us a brief synopsis of how you perceived the change in the last 3 months?
So, with connection to what we speak today, first I want to say thank you for having me tonight or this morning with you in the States. And connecting to what we speak about today, I think that when you ask for a shift in the day after October 7th, you need to understand first what was the year before the October 7th. And I just mentioned before that originally the Stanford University asked me to speak about the what we call the legal reform in Israel and the polarity of the society in Israel, where basically you defined yourself, or the society defined you by, do you support or do you not support what we call the legal revolution, the legal reform, depends what side you stand with. And I think that in this year, the break or the gap between two sides of the Israeli society was probably the stronger we ever experienced. I don't think we ever experienced such a big gap or break between two sides of the society in Israel. And in one day, it seems like it flipped. And when I need to write about it several weeks ago, I used the term "we met again" outside of the social networks. For the first time in a year, Israelis left the social networks and they met each other again. And in a way, we met ourselves again. And we met at the volunteering sites where we collected donations for soldiers and the refugees. And then we met at the reserves and then in the convention grounds, and when people from left and right put the uniforms on and went into the Gaza Strip. And we met when we had to went and comfort those who lost everything in this horrible day. And unfortunately, we met on those horrific lists of the deaths that we saw every morning. And people start to realize that when Hamas attacked, he did not stop to ask, wait, did you vote for this or that? Did you support or did you not support the reform? And just to remind that before the 7th of October, there was people here that says, the government is basically destroying the democracy, so we will not volunteer to the army anymore. And everything was wiped in a way because everybody forgot everything and just went and protected their country. So when you ask about the shift, I think that the first thing that we saw in the beginning, and probably in the next 45 minutes, we're going to speak about what happened later on. But in the first days, weeks, even months, we forgot almost everything and we tried hard to keep it. People said, do not go back, do not become what we call the person of yesterday, the voices of October 6th. There is something bigger here than those small arguments about how the legal system of Israel is going to look like and the separation of powers between the government and all the things that we spoke about before. Something happened we got united again. Let's keep it. And I think that was the strongest voice after October 7th. We see today, and probably going to speak about it later on, that those voices are getting a bit weaker and some other voices are getting louder. But I think that in that specific date, I will put the title, the Israeli people met each other again outside of the social media.
Well, that's an interesting opening. Omer, let's hear what you have to say. And you might want to build on that. How did that manifest itself, say, in the social media platforms and in the way people communicated on and offline?
I think Tomer's idea of this physical unity that came together after, I think, a massive digital division is a very accurate and very astute point that touches to something very important that did happen post October 7th or during October 7th. I think the invert of that, or the flip side of that, is that though we are quite unified internally, Israelis are now getting, I think, a very big taste of how that polarization feels externally. Because I think the division that existed between the left and right in Israel now exists between Israel and the rest of the world. Because what actually happened on October 7th is something that I would almost use a philosophical term to describe, which is an epistemological schism. Like the world broke for Israelis, and their connection with the world was detached. And I think in the Trump era, we used to think about echo chambers. I think we're long gone. I think we now live in iron lungs. You know what I mean? And the divide between the perspectives of Israelis and the rest of the world is so big that there's something actually jarring about that. And if you go back to October 7th, you can find the origins of that. And I want to talk very briefly about that, because as Hamas terrorists were entering Israel, there was in tandem a digital onslaught on Israeli society as well. And that's very important to understand. I'm going to try to avoid talking about Hasbara, which is one of my least favorite words ever. But I will say that I think
Hasbara, for the non-Hebrew speakers, is the we were talking
Israeli public diplomacy.
it's an effort to explain a position, particularly of the government of Israel's official.
Exactly. So I'm not talking about the Israeli kind of the way it pushes out its narrative, but I'm rather talking about the Israeli kind of actual experience of the digital space. What happened on October 7th is that not only did our government not function in terms of its ability to defend our borders, but actually failed in its ability to defend our digital sovereignty in a very basic way. And I think the Israeli home front was exposed to massive Hamas propaganda in the form of actual snuff videos for, I want to say, roughly about 100 to 200 hours into this event. And I think what people externally don't understand is that Israelis are still living October 7th. So psychologically in our headspace, we live in an ecosystem in which we're constantly being exposed anew to these materials. And we're also not seeing a lot of other kind of materials. And I think that does touch to your initial comment to me about, wow, does Haaretz actually have a disinformation beat? Yes, because disinformation now is actually what you can think of as a national security front. So it also has to do with brands and PR and politics, but it's also national security. If you have fake accounts mucking around in your during elections, that's a national security issue. If you have a terrorist organization waging psychological warfare against your citizenry, it's a national security issue. And I don't support over-regulation. I don't think there should be a ministry of truth or something like that. But I think there's a lot to be said about how exposed the Israeli home front was to this stuff. And maybe to connect to what Tomer was saying, the Hamas digital offensive was aided by three forces, all of which have been left to fester, and all of which have been festering on the wound or the issue that is social media. So two of those are Iran and Russia. So those are external forces that have long kind of pushed chaos in Israel and latched onto October 7th to either amplify Hamas or push their own narrative. I exposed together with reporters in Le Monde a Russian campaign called Doppelganger, which just hijacked Gaza to push out the Russian agenda. But the third party that helped push this out was kind of the radical Israeli right, which in the early hours of the war, while our state kind of wasn't functioning, stepped up with a massive body of conspiracy theories that also helped kind of, I think, alienate the Israeli world from the rest of the world. And what's so interesting is that you actually find a perfect overlap between the far extreme pro-Bibi QAnon, like the Israeli QAnon. It's almost fully aligned with the Hamas Iran kind of stuff. They're actually amplifying Hamas and Iranian narratives. For example, this idea that the Israeli army betrayed the Israeli society and somehow knew about the attack and did nothing. And these are narratives that are originating from foreign actors that wish for Israel's destruction, but are being amplified by local forces invested in the division that Tomer spoke about prior.
Well, let me just ask this because you mentioned it before we go on to the next question. I remember hearing once a figure from a professor who studies this whole issue of social media that about 55% of the news sites in the US, which are considered legitimate, actually are based in Moscow or Russian sponsored in terms of attempting to diffuse it. I don't know if that number is correct, but I'm wondering to what extent you feel that the messages received by the Israeli public, we'll talk about the global public as well later, but how much they were driven by outside forces that sought to distort the actual facts of the event. Do you have a sense of that, or either of you?
I want to just, Tomer, before I let you respond to this, like, I really want to say about this. I think we have to be very careful with this stuff. I think my big take on this, and I've also studied history, is that this information has always existed. It's just a question of what allows it to scale. There's always been efforts from foreign states to muck around with other states. Israel does it as well. The US did it. Anyone knows anything about the history of America and South America knows this, the US and South America. So we've always seen this. Now it's just scaling. What's so interesting in Israel is that you see how it's almost like a perfect storm. Like these Russian influence stuff, it exists. Like Iranian influence networks exist. It's a real thing. The question is how big of an impact they're allowed to have on society. And in Israel, what we've discovered, for example, is that they're allowed to have a disproportionate effect on society. For example, Telegram, which is a network that is unregulated, is a network that is used by Netanyahu in the far right as an alternative to proper media, but is also one that is, now Hamas's main information channel. And if someone would have nipped this in the bud, and if this would have been brought under different forms of legal regulation in the past, we wouldn't be here. But I've digressed. I just don't like over amplifying the foreign threat. The foreign threat is helping amplifying existing problems, and they allow existing problems that already exist to scale. Sorry, Tomer.
Tomer, do you have anything to add to that particular analysis?
I just want to I want to offer another if I might explanation for that. And I think that one of the things that was very clear in Israel of the first couple of weeks is we were so traumatized by what happened, because we live in a country that we think that we have one of the strongest army, and we feel very secure. And for the first time in our lives, none of us felt secure, right? One of my friends told me, "You're not post-traumatic, you're still in the trauma." And I think that many Israelis can amplify what I'm going to say now. Every night we locked all the doors, and every night we locked all the windows, and we felt unsafe in our home, in our cities, in the country. And we also felt, as you mentioned, unsafe to go abroad because we kept hearing about all those attacks against the Israelis and Jews. And because we were so traumatized, all of us were looked for explanations. We were looking for explanations about how the hell this horrible thing happened. And when you look for explanation, and when you're not believing that the reality you see, this is a very good ground for conspiracies to come. And when you have this ground for conspiracy, and when you have the people who are looking for explanations, you have the other people from the other side who start pushing those conspirations and those conspiracies, and they can be, as Omer mentioned, people like foreign Iran or Russia or far right. But I'll have to say that also in the common center or even left, people were looking for explanations, and there were some fake news also, in some local newspapers in Israel mentioned that Netanyahu had some information before, yes or no, and the Shabak or Mossad had information before. And in the beginning, the first couple of weeks, you had all those misinformation, all those fake news going around, and everybody was just looking for something that will help him understand how the hell we woke up in the October 7th morning into this hell. And we have to be very careful here, and it's not only the far right people. I think it's probably all of us Israelis looking for those explanations, and probably find them everywhere we can just put our hand.
The point about the far right was just, I think that is, because I agree with you, it's not an attempt to just tarnish one side. I think we're seeing a lot of the Israeli center left today endorsing a lot of what I call naive misinformation, things they think help the Israeli narrative, but are false. Like, 40 beheaded babies, people who share that fact, like there's no indication there were 40. There's no indication that we have like that specific number, right? So if you're amplifying that, it's very likely you're pushing out information that is.
Could you make a distinction between the amplification of a
Yes.
fact and
Yes.
full-fledged fabrication? I mean,
So there's a
the word
distinction academically between this and this.
That seems to be a fact which has been established. Nobody likes to watch
Yes.
those videos, but that seems to be clear. So the actual numbers may be falsification, but not the event
It's
itself.
not falsification. Let's clarify. There's misinformation, which is me sharing something that may or not be right, but I'm doing it in good faith. And there's me pushing out a fake fact for nefarious purposes. I think in the center left and among Israeli society, we're seeing people sharing. They're over amplifying, they're exaggerating claims that they think help the Israeli narrative, which are based on truth. There was terrible things. I'm saying specifically, we don't need to over amplify them. And I think we've seen people, for example, this number of 40 beheaded babies is a very specific claim. The 40, like, for example, as a journalist, I'll tell you, we think twice before we commit to numbers and headlines, right? And there's something about that number and how much it was spread that I think obfuscated the point, which is the number was over 0, which is all that actually matters, right?
I think
And I
that's a
think,
great point.
yeah.
I'd like to ask, because I think it would be important for all of us to have a sense, if we assume that there was external attempts to distort and to misreport, there was, and you mentioned that was nefarious motivations. What exactly are Israel's adversaries trying to achieve in skewing or playing with the messaging? Is it just a demoralization? I mean, how do you guys understand what they're trying to do here, so we can understand? Because I think any kind of informed response, we'll talk about what we should be doing in terms of cybersecurity or making our society more resilient to these messages. But I think we have to understand what we're up against and why they are pursuing this. I don't know if you have any ideas on that.
As I mentioned before, that one of the things that represents the year that we had before the October 7th, 2000, like the year of 2023, is the fact that many of the protesters, especially from the left side, they kept saying that if the government will go on with demolish the Israeli democracy, that's the way we saw it, in the end, people will not volunteer into the army, especially the reserve, by the way, and especially the pilots. They were kind of waving this flag, saying that we will not volunteer to the army, and in the end, Israel, we're going to get into a very dangerous era in a security terms. And I think one of the people who said it clear and loud was the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant. And he gave his famous speech somewhere in mid-March, and like about 2 hours after he gave this speech, saying we should stop with this reform because the security of Israel is gonna be damaged. Netanyahu fired him, and then the mass, I think thousands, hundreds of thousands of people went into the streets and basically blocked roads and burned whatever they could burn. Out of this understanding, though, that this reform, the power who are pushing the reforms, are destroying and damaging the security of Israel. So I believe, and I will be again very careful with it, but I believe that in some point, people from Hamas, maybe from Iran, maybe from Russia, when they saw what happens in Israel, when they saw the divide between the people, when they saw those people those statements about we're not going to join the army, they said, okay, this is a good time to attack Israel, and I think in a way, some of them were very surprised by the fact that none of that really happened, and I open a quote and saying, in most of the world, when a disaster happens, the first people to come are the thieves and the looters. In Israel, when a disaster happens, the first people to come are the one who want to help and to donate and give money, and suddenly and I think we should stop for a second and look at it, because this is something very special about these crazy people who lives in Israel. Right, we go into the danger because we want to help each other, and we donate money and food and whatever we can.
October 7th had several iconic interventions, often by aging generals who captured the public imagination by doing just that, saying, "Oh my gosh, maybe I can lend a hand," and put themselves in harm's way. So yes, there was no little amount of that, and of course, civil societies things. I want to get back to this question of what. Given the fact that you're saying that perhaps maybe one of their goals was to create the misapprehension that Israel was more divided than it actually was, and maybe that was what you want to talk about that for a second?
So I was going to finish my
sure,
point.
sorry.
Basically, you mentioned that, yeah, you gave the bottom line exactly. So I think people who were looking for this divided Israel to attack, and I think they hope to find us in a very weak spot. They were right in a way, and I think that now they just want to try and raise again this division between both sides of Israeli society.
I would take that even a step further. I think that as we move forward, and I think as people, as journalists or academics, we're allowed a slightly different perspective, an external one. I think one of the big lessons of October 7th is that our perception of the relationship of power between Israel and the Palestinians is different than what we understood it to be. And I think one of the big takeaways for me is that there is an alliance between the Likud and Hamas. So at this point, this is not something that I think can be blown off. It's not an explicit alliance. Obviously, they're not collaborating, but they are obviously in some kind of lockstep, which I think politically is very important to say at this point. So the only two people to benefit from high death tolls in Gaza and in Israel are the current Israeli government and Hamas. And I think that's a very important point to be made. And I think in that sense, there is a shared interest there. I don't think I think it's a confluence of shared interest, but I think there are parties, both externally and internally, that benefit from not a divided society, but from the divided society we now live in. When Israel reaches the point of a civil collapse, that aids not only our enemies, it also aids certain political parties that aim to thrive off situations of chaos. And I think we're seeing that in play now. I want to tell the story about.
I want to just clarify this, Omer, because I think it's a fairly bold.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not sure I agree with it. Are you insinuating that, in fact, some of the fake news that would suggest that Israel's divided is being supplied by Likud supporters or people
No, I'm saying the Likud benefits
the goal of creating
from the same schisms.
Center left, or is it?
I think the same societal schisms that aid our enemies also aid populist right within Israel. And I'll give a non-political example to flesh that out. Wonderful. Earlier this week, a Likud lawmaker by the name of Tali Gottlieb published a fake story for the second time, accusing a person in the Shabak, in the Shin Bet services, of being in touch with Hamas prior to the attack, and then providing that information to the Mossad. This is all completely fake in terms of, like, there was no conversation with the Hamas, and this was written up as a story to prove, one, that the Israeli Secret Service organizations betrayed Israel, but more importantly, to actually make the claim that the protest movement is somehow implicit in this because this person in the Shin Bet who got the phone call is married to the head of the protest movement or one of the protest leaders. So it's and this was shared on a fake news website. So just for context, if you reveal the identity of an Israeli Shin Bet officer, you are now breaking the Israeli Shabak law. This is a criminal offense. I would say tantamount to aiding the enemy during war. And I'm not this is the legal position. I'm not voicing my opinion. This is and the Mossad and the Shabak had to proactively deny a story which not only exposed one of their officers, but also implicated the army, implicated them as being a traitor's force during time of war. So I think, maybe you think she's right at some level. Maybe you think the protest movement actually is dangerous in a way. But it's a very beautiful example of how this shared, and the last point being that this narrative of the IDF dying is a narrative that social media research discovered originated in Iran. So we're seeing how a talking point originating in probably the Iranian intelligence apparatus is being amplified by a government official, and its target is the Israeli defense establishment while we're at war, while a law is being broken, that it has to do with defending the personal safety of Israeli security forces. So
here's my question. Do you believe that a member of Knesset Gottlieb was aware of the source of that? In other words, was this something that was
yes? You know why? Because it's the second time. Yes, because the second time the story has come out, and she's the source of the story. So the story itself actually says that the story is based on someone who is a lawmaker, in so many words, and she herself is the first person so it's quite her, and the Mossad has actually called her out. Again, I just want to underscore the point I'm trying to make. There is a confluence between the populist right and foreign interest. And you asked, what is the goal? The goal is a divided society. The endpoints are different. They want it for different reasons. One side wants to destroy Israel, and one side wants to take over Israel or maintain its political control. So the goals are different, but it needs to be said quite explicitly at this point that the current government and large swaths of it share, at least at this informational fact level warfare, interest with foreign assets. The other
Yeah.
point, which I would say, is that Netanyahu and the Israeli government also benefits from Israel being socially isolated. So the more Israelis feel attacked, the more likely they are to forgive their government for the massive failure and to kind of buy into nationalism. And I think that's also what's happening now. This unity that Thomas spoke about is falling apart, and Israelis feel isolated from the world. And I think, in that sense, part of Netanyahu's strategy in terms of maintaining power and saying, even though I screwed up big time, you still need me, has to do exactly with this logic. So I think it's a confluence of interest, and that in your
Okay,
sense,
but
you're right. I'm
you're
making a
not
bold
claiming
statement.
that there was any kind of
No. They're
effort
not.
or
They're
a
not
conscious
corroborating.
effort for Israel.
No.
As much as one may have criticism of right-wing members of Likud,
No.
we're not accusing them of consorting with the enemy during times of war to weaken the.
No, but I am saying that they are helping the enemy during times of war,
Okay,
and
I
I think that's an
understand that.
important thing to be said. That's
Tomer, what do you have to say about such sort of a fairly bold assertion?
So I was listening to Omer, and I want to agree with him on the symptom, but I think the disease is a bit different, and I think that some of the parties who are in the coalition now or in the government now found the war, basically what happened in Israel for the last 4 months, and the fear of the public helped them to basically promote inner agendas or ideologies that in peacetime they wouldn't be able to. And I think the biggest example I can give is Itamar Ben-Gvir, for example, who for years tries to open to make it more easy to people in Israel to get weapons and to arm the society in Israel, and no one stops him to do it now. And so I think he uses the fear of the people in Israel in order to give more and more weapons to the people. And I think that the amount of weapons within the Israeli society was, I think, 6 or 7 times bigger than it was before the October 7th. And by the way, we already see what it's causing. We already see accidents, and we already see people who are using these weapons for making crimes, etc. And I think that we see now, and this is the shift, the second shift, let's call it. The first one was between the October 7th, the 6th, and the 7th. And now we see another shift, is how slowly, and I will say Netanyahu and Netanyahu people are standing behind it. There is some finger who start to put another a wall between two sides of the society in Israel in order to support what I think is basically Netanyahu's campaign in what he sees as the next elections. And if you noticed, the topics of the conversation in Israel now is, are you pro or against making a deal with Hamas to bring back the hostages? And in a very funny way, I'll say, somehow, if you're pro bringing the hostages back, you are considered to be now left in Israel. And if you're against it, you're considered to be right in Israel. How come? And when you start reading the articles of the people who are making those claims and who are making those differentiation between those two sides, you see the same writers, the same, I will say, quote unquote, journalists that 5 months ago were the journalists who wrote pro the legal reform and pro Netanyahu, etc. So there is a very strong, we call it the machine in Israel, right? There is a very strong system that works like a machine
hate machine, we
that
call it.
tries to promote ideas in Israel, and it's always the same people, it always the same Twitter accounts, it always work in the same direction. And it's very easy to see it right now, because for the first time, I think, and that goes back to the unity I was mentioning about, the first time that people are not taking as granted the things that those so-called journalists or so-called Twitter accounts are telling them. And you can see how Netanyahu's chamber every couple of weeks try something else to divide the people. In the beginning, they were talking about the Oslo agreements as the reasons for what happened in October 7, 2023. I just remind to our viewers that the Oslo agreements were way back in 1993. So they try to accuse something that happened 25 years ago or 30 years ago almost in what happened in October 7th. And then they try to blame the disengagement. It didn't work as well. And they try to, and so they keep looking for a way to divide us until the past couple of weeks. I think that the unity that we spoke about was strong enough. I think that the Israeli society was strong enough to deal with it. And unfortunately, I see it cracks a little bit in the last couple of weeks. And it goes again around the idea of the yes or no deal to bring back the hostages.
I'm going to change the direction just a little bit from the internal, misuse of information, to talk a little bit more about the external, because I think when we're at times of war, that may be the most pressing one. I remember not so long ago, maybe it was a decade, when a unsuspecting young man, I'm talking about a 14, 15-year-old, was lured to a meeting, I think, and was murdered by Palestinians because they created a fake Facebook site and created some sort of a false romantic interest and brought him there. And I think that social media makes Israelis as individuals, but also as a society, is much more vulnerable to manipulation. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what you've seen during the war and what we might do as a society to, I know that the army spokesperson time and again would tell people, please do not repeat messages until they have been repeated. There is a tendency in Israel, of course, because everybody talks to everybody. If you're walking down the street and seeing friends, if there's going to be bad news coming from Gaza, you'll find out about it 6 or 8 hours beforehand, because so my question is, how do we protect ourselves from the attempts by our adversaries outside of Israel to take advantage of this vulnerability? And so you want to start with that, Omer, and move over to Tomer?
Yeah, I think it's a really smart question. I think for me, it touches to kind of what happened post October 7th, when we got a very clear lesson in how today, in the age of social media, politics is somehow information warfare. So if you're pro or anti-Israel, for some reason in the digital age, you find the need to either deny the facts of the other side systematically or share what you perceive to be facts that help your side. So your actual conception of politics has to do with either amplification or muffling or actually denying politics. In that sense, I would suggest that this war is not actually between the pro and anti-Israel, but it's actually between the sides who can, deal with facts and who can. And that's why, for me, what's happening now is so heartbreaking, because you see how, like, Israel's efforts to explain itself, even in good faith, right? For example, you take something like the death toll, the fact that the Israeli army had the integrity to update the death toll and lower it because they had actually finished fact checking, or that the Israeli army had the integrity to admit that it had in error killed 3 hostages. All this information, you see it being manipulated and used against Israel. And I think that's what's so sad about what's happening now. You see how people acting in good faith are amplifying manipulation. And therefore, my answer to
I have to ask you this, because I find it to be one of the most just unimaginable situations. I can't think of a atrocity that was as gleefully broadcast in real time as this particular October 7th massacre. I mean, it was just one of the most appalling things about it was this, the
self-documentation.
Yet now we find in various and sundry corners of the internet deniers that it happened at all, or that it was some sort of thing. How do you explain that, and how do people buy it when we have the Hamas?
It's happening together. That's what's so interesting. That's what's so interesting, that that's actually the same people. The same people who are gleefully sharing the documentation are also the ones gleefully doing the denialism. And I think the explanation is that you have politics is perceived, and their force is pushing us to that, as this kind of information warfare. But and you can see, for example, the obsession about like the rape debate. There's something so heartbreaking about that. You see how there's so much good journalistic effort has gone into this, and you're fighting this impossible battle. There's just rampant unacceptance of what has just been so factually based at this point. There was a campaign of sexual violence. We can maybe argue about specific instance of scale, but it's just a fact. And I don't get why people are so gleefully into the denial of it. And I think it comes down to my reading of the geopolitical map, or the digital map, is that the divide is between the people who can admit that there was murder and rape on October 7th, and also admit and accept that there's a high death toll in Gaza, and those who think that those are two mutually exclusive positions. And I think that's the point.
That's because people who would be defending, say, who have a pro-Palestinian perspective, would be concerned that acknowledging those kind of events would defame the entire Palestinian national aspirations or something like that? You think that's an explanation?
For sure, but I think that's the problem. I think we have to get to a point where we have some shared facts. And if you think you're helping one side by creating this echo chamber and creating this idealized version, you're actually undermining the conditions of possibility for peace, which would be a shared version of reality. We might not agree about what solution, but we need to be able to say innocent Israeli civilians were murdered and raped violently, horrifically on October 7th. And in response to that, Israel launched a military campaign in which over 20,000 Gazans were killed. And those are two statements of fact that we should be able to hold together as true in one statement, even if you think both sides are justified, which would make you terrible. But it doesn't matter. We can still say proposition of facts. And I think for me as a reporter, that is actual political struggle, to create a fact-based reality, to explain how we do our journalism, to create high-quality journalism that does actually put forward facts that even if someone will manipulate in bad faith, if someone does want to intake in a good way, will do that. So I don't participate in this information warfare, and I think that's a huge thing.
Thank you so much. Tomer, as somebody who comes from the civil society side, as a policy advocate, Omer's thrown a lot of stuff out there. How do you see this, and how do we as a society begin to protect ourselves from some of these phenomena?
So exactly from my point of view, I want to say first, I will expect my government to protect me from that before I use the society. And I'll say that my government for the past 10 or 15 years neglected the foreign affairs, neglected diplomacy, dry them out. I think that the poorest office in the Israeli government in the past years is the foreign affairs government office. And that's like a known fact. There's a joke in Israel that every time they want to have a meeting with a different office, they go to their offices because they have coffee and they don't. So, and that's like a thing in Israel. We know that. And that's because of inner political reasons, because Netanyahu in some point understood that the strongest minister is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and therefore he always assigned to it one of the weakest politicians over there and doesn't give him money, etc. But we're now paying the price of 15 years of neglection of our foreign affairs, of our diplomacy, of the fact that both in Europe and in the United States, there was a new generation of ignorancy, young, ignorant people who doesn't know what's going on in the Middle East and have their news from 1 or 2 minutes videos in TikTok or Instagram or whatever, and does not understand. And when our politicians, when our people in the UN, for example, Gilad Erdan, when he goes and speak to the American audience, he doesn't really speak to the American audience. He speak back home to his base, to his voters, because this is the way they do it here in Israel for the past years. So he caused more damage. I just imagine the young American or the young European watching an Israeli official speaks, and it's like, what the hell is he talking about? He doesn't even understand that this person is talking back home. So this is one thing we need to understand. And for me, as a civil society, and this is a thing, by the way, that we did for the past 5, 6, 7 years. We actually, one of the things that we did here, we went to the Supreme Court. In some point, Netanyahu, I think, was about 40 or 50 ambassadors. He didn't
appoint them.
He didn't appoint them because he wanted to weak the Foreign Affairs Office.
I have to ask a question before you go on to your next point. I know you have several other things, but I must ask. To me, the appointment of ambassadors and the whole model of Israeli diplomatic strength and posture dependent on individuals doesn't really hold up in an internet age when anybody can Zoom with anybody. And so it used to be, it was very important to have a spokesperson locally who had this sort of official position. The question is New Zealand doesn't have ambassadors in about 2/3 of the country with whom they have diplomatic relations because they think it's actually superfluous or there's better ways to spend their money. Do you think that we need, in light of what I agree is a massive failure of our public relations, is going back to a strong, classical system with an ambassador who's usually a white man in his 50s or 60s as the face of Israel? Is that really the way to win back the hearts and minds of a young generation of Europeans and Americans?
So I say it's a part of a system, right? When you neglected the person in the front, you will for sure neglect everything beneath him. And when there is, it doesn't have to be, by the way, a white man in the age of these 50s, 60s. You can also play with it. But when there is a person who can shout and knock on the table and says, "Give me the budget I need," etc. So in the end, there is something going on, and the wheels are turning. And when you neglect everything, so nothing happens. And Israel is not New Zealand, right? We know that we need to explain ourselves all the time. We have here a keep going situation of 75 years. And by the way, besides the 75 years, people doesn't like Jews. And we need to put it on the table. I understood it hardly in the past 4 months. And we can give all those fancy reasons, academical reasons about what happened and how it connected to the social media. But in the bottom of it, and it's very unfortunate to say, people doesn't like us. And that goes back 2,000 years ago, and it has nothing to do with social medias. The rest is
But
just
we
layers
can't
on
do
it.
anything about that. No, like that to me is a mute point because like you're right, but that to me as a Jew and as someone who also agrees with you, that means it's incumbent on me to find a way to improve my position. If I'm in this victimhood state of mind where there people don't like me,
I totally agree with you on that, by the
yeah.
way. Totally
So it's
agree
an
with you.
ethical position that I can take from that, which will
Totally
actually
agree,
push me
but
to a different point.
of course. I said it as a comment to the New Zealand comment by Aaron. So I just want to say, so from that point of view, I will say that my government neglected me. I blame my government. From the perspective of social activists, and that was your original question, of course. Because we have such a strong civic society in Israel, one of the funniest things that happened right after the massacre, because our government did not function at all, you had such a strong civic initiatives, both in Israel and both forward to the rest of the world. And some of them were very strong initiative of Hasbara, as you mentioned, of advocacy, of explaining what's going on. And you have, we had a minister of advocacy, of public diplomacy, who did nothing, keep whining that she doesn't have enough budget. And then you have the three guys in their 20s that with no money made all those videos and graphics and set them all over the place, and hashtag Hamas is ISIS, for example, and they made a huge difference.
And
So I think
Eretz Nehederet, Israel Satirical, the show also
Eretz
hundreds of millions of
Nehederet is
downloads
another
for
good
their
example.
work
So
as well.
one of the things that I think, first, we have a very strong civic society in Israel, but this strong civic society got even stronger in a year of protesting, and that basically saved us in many ways. Also, Achim LaNeshek, for example, who were the first. Achim LaNeshek is one of the
Brothers in
biggest
Arms.
organizations.
This is a public
Brothers in
interest.
Arms, yeah.
It's a group of military veterans who had a very, very powerful role in the social protests or the anti-judicial reform protest. Please continue.
So there was a good example of organization who already used the logistics and organizational to basically to support the army, to support the refugees, etc. But many people who met each other during the year of marching together in the streets and protesting against the government used the knowledge they had, used the connections they had with each other to start and basically do what they're good in. So if you were good in making videos against the legal reform or revolution, now you're going to use your power against all those like Hamas or pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas TikTokers, YouTubers, bloggers from around the world. And you see some amazing things that people are doing. None of that, unfortunately, is by the support of our government. And I'll add another thing to it, and with that I'll finish my very long answer. And that goes back to what happened in Israel in the past month. Not only that the government is not supporting that, what we see now is that the government is start to try and tackle it, because now they're afraid that, oh wait, this guy who was a very good speaker or is a very good YouTuber, 4 or 5 months ago, he was against the government. So we cannot allow him to be as
We
strong
saw
as he
that with,
become now.
yeah, we
So
saw
we need to find a way.
With Sarah Netanyahu's objection to one of Israel's most effective spokespersons.
Yeah.
As we pivot over to the public, the transition to the questions from our participants, I do want to give you just sort of 2 or 3 minutes for each of you to say, what are you doing in your specific role, both as a representative of civil society and the Israeli good governance NGOs, or in the to combat the false messaging? I mean, it seems to me, as somebody who grew up in the United States, there was a broadcaster by the name of Walter Cronkite. When he spoke, there was truth. Today, we don't have a single source of truth. And what kind of things are you trying to move us forward so that the public will know, both inside of Israel and outside, what they should actually believe? So do you want to start with that, Omer, and then we'll go back to you, Tomer, and then we'll open it up to the questions of the participants.
Sure. So I think for many years as a journalist, I've had a pretty clear kind of vision that the problem is that we live in a country in which my government actively politicizes knowledge. So for me, that's always been an issue. And I think we now live in a very direct example of what we can call the Hasbara paradox. So this paradox would be Israel has for years invested in this, but when we actually needed it, we discovered it doesn't work. And we needed civil society to step up. And I think what's interesting about that as a point is that, and this will maybe be a bit of a bold point, but I think you do need to actually call out lies. So I think the fact that Netanyahu has made us all quite used to him lying has severely undermined Israel's position in the long run. I think you cannot disconnect between the fact that people do not believe the IDF today when they publish infographics of real Hamas tunnels and terror tunnels, and the fact that Netanyahu stood in the UN in 2015 with a fake infographic that looked like a cartoon of an Iranian bomb. So I think Israel has learned the limits of public diplomacy, and that when you try to defend things that are not true or morally wrong, like, for example, the Israeli military occupation of the West Bank, when you do actually need your public diplomacy apparatus, people don't believe it. And I think that's a really important point, because I think, to me, it all comes back to this basic solution where it's we all need to be invested in stopping manipulation of facts. We all need to be invested in digital literacy. And I think the forces who oppose those kind of things and oppose, for example, concrete regulatory steps you can take to rein in social media are part of the problem. And it's not a uniquely Israel problem. In Brazil, in the US, in Japan, across the world, we see social media running rampant also because there's governments who don't want to regulate that. And I think this wider kind of confluence is what makes it so hard now. So I generally believe in the very humanistic task of doing fact-based journalism. I think that's really important, and I believe in education and digital literacy, and think there are no solutions beyond that.
Okay, Tomer, how are you in the Council for Good Government in Israel and Quality Government in Israel? What are you doing specific? What's on your agenda when you wake up in the morning and think about these issues?
So I'll say first that we understood about 3 or 4 years ago that one of the biggest future problems are going to be what you call the alternative facts, cyber, by the way, attacks. And now we see the AI, and we actually just launched a new department within the movement that is going to deal with basically all of those things. Because we use both tools of legal tool and civic tools. So one of the things that we do in the legal field is we try to push both regulation and legislation that is supposed to deal with the social medias and the fact that the alternative facts. Israel is years behind Europe and the US when it goes to regulations about the social medias. We're not there at all. Just for the audience, our laws of elections, for example, that we know that fake news and false facts are very strong players, key players even when it comes to elections. Our laws of election are the same laws from 1956. And when we tried to change it, we were that close, by the way, to change it in the year of 2019. We got the agreement of all the parties within the Knesset, within the parliament. And in the last moment, one person decided to block it, and this person is Benjamin Netanyahu. And then you ask yourself, who's earning from the fact that we don't have a strong regulation about the social medias in Israel? So this is one thing that we're doing. We try to promote, we try to push it. Unfortunately, I have to say, more and more people in Israel understood what Netanyahu understood already 10 years ago, that, you know, as a member of the Knesset, a parliament member of the Knesset, you don't need to change the law, because then in a way you're going to hurt yourself. So that's a thing we do. And in our civic, we go and try to educate, basically, to go to schools and to go to academia, universities, etc., to explain and to make people understand the dangers when it comes for the democracy side, the dangerous to the democracy, the dangers to the country from what we call alternative facts and fake news. It's not just a funny thing we can talk about. You can find yourself very easy in what we call a hollow democracy, right? You're going to have all the institutions, but they're going to basically worth nothing. Even though you think you have a free media, even though you think you have a free independent court, basically you have one strong power, that's the government, that controls everything you think even, and you know. And that's the thing we try to educate the public in Israel to understand.
Well, thank you very much. And now we're going to open up this webinar to the participants. We already have a question submitted by Harvey Cohen, which I'll read to you all, but I just want to tell those who are listening, if you raise your hand, I will unmute you and allow you to speak out and offer a question. But if you want to present that with some sort of a preface, that's fine too. But Harvey Cohen asks the following: please comment on the very rapid response of the radical left after October 7th to put the entire blame on Israel for the Gaza war. For example, the very rapid statement from Harvard leftist organizations condemning Israel without any comments on Hamas actions. So perhaps you'd like to comment on the way that the left, both in the United States and beyond, has both framed and responded to the present war.
I can.
So,
Let's start
Omer,
let's start with
you
Tomer.
go first, Omer.
Okay, Omer, go right ahead then.
I'll say a short answer. I think one of the most interesting experience, and I say this as an Israeli leftist, has been indeed learning that there are parts of the global left that, as Tomer said before, do not like Israel and are very quick to kind of call us out. That being said, I think that statement and specific statements of that are indicative to the point I was trying to make before, which is we live in a world in which facts have been completely politicized. Every political action now has to involve denying the other side's fact, and therefore I'm also weary or danger or scared of thinking also in the terms of the way your question was posed. I don't think the problem is just these far left organizations. I think that's a symptom of a much bigger problem, which is that we live in a world in which all facts have been polarized, and we live in a world in which if you don't like leftists, you can sign up to a newsletter just for pro-Israel organizations and get all the condemnations you like, or vice versa. And I think that divide is the bigger issue than any specific anecdote linked to it.
Tomer.
Yeah, just so Alon basically, almost sorry, basically said most of it. I just want to add that what happened in Harvard University, I think, is that exactly a good example of when you hear something about Israel and Palestine, you're going to be pro-Palestine first thing, and then you may be going to ask questions. And we like the strongest example for that was the fact that I think was like 25 or 30 unions, student unions,
Organizations,
signed the petitions. In the first 2 or 3 hours, people are still got shot and raped in the Nova Party while those people signed the petition saying Israel is an aggressor. That made me understand that those people know nothing, and they're just, they will be very fast to condemn and very fast to put the blame on Israel. And again, I think in a way that this is a fault of Israel, basically, to neglect this field for so many years. And now we have a lot of work ahead of us, I think. And that's, by the way, another thing when we speak about what happened in Israel after October 7 is the understanding that the people that we called friends, that, there's a saying, the betrayal of the world left, we call it in Israel. Understanding that the people that we thought that we share the same values with were the first people to show us their backs. And this is a very long journey. We need to start stepping into it to basically explain those people who in the Middle East share your same values, and who are the people that are, I don't want to say, the bad guys, basically. You need to understand that.
Omer, I see you chopping it up for a follow-up.
Just a small comment, because I think that's a really, really smart and accurate point by Tomer. And I think when he says it's this Israeli government's fault, he's right in the sense where for many years we've seen this growing divide between kind of young liberals in Israel. And for many times we've been warned about this. And I think actually a proper diplomatic apparatus does actually help solve some of this stuff. And I think Israel's pivot to the right over the years was long. We were warned about this. And I think in tandem to that, you do see externally funded radicalization. It's also true that certain parts of the left have been influenced by foreign forces. But again, we were very cognizant of that. We always knew that was happening, and we were long being warned. And I think Israel's decision and the way it conducted itself, for example, around issues like the BDS, in retrospect, I think helped fuel a lot of these problems and far from laying the groundwork to helping us to solve October 7th, it actually put us much worse off.
So again, I want to invite anybody who's a guest or participant to raise their hand and let us know, or you can just, if you don't feel comfortable speaking, you can submit a written question in the Q&A panel. But I will follow up, because I think one of the things we've seen here is in the anti-Israeli sentiment that has really exploded amongst the left across cities in Europe and the United States, is really a 15 or 20-year paradigm shift in social sciences, where the so-called settler colonialist paradigm and perception that the whole world can be divided into two kinds of people, those who are exploiting, who are colonialists, and those who are the victims, and somehow applying this to Israel, which, quite honestly, as somebody who understands a thing or two about Israeli history, it's not an appropriate analogy. I mean, I don't know how anybody could look at Israel and say that you're a colonialist in the classic sense of the word, given the fact that Jews in Israel have at least a 2,000-year connection, maybe longer, 3,000-year collection. I have great-great-grandfathers buried in Sfat in the 19th century. It doesn't fit that kind of thing. You could argue about Israeli policies on the West Bank or how Israelis have treated the Palestinians, but it doesn't have that kind of a thing. And yet that seems to be a paradigm which Israel has been pushed into, and I would say fairly inappropriately. Is there anything that could be done, both in terms of the press or in Israeli messaging, to try to disabuse those people who have that kind of perspective, or is it too deeply entrenched in the social science training and then thinking of the academics and the people who graduate from those institutions? So I kind of wanted to throw that out as a challenge, because I think there's a ideological source behind some of the misinformation we've seen.
So I'll start with a joke or a funny thing that happened to me a few years
We need
ago.
some of that. We've been a little humorless today, so go for
So
it.
someone told me I think it was Ireland or something. I was in a debate, and someone told me, "You are what was the word he was using? Something against the brown and black people in Israel, and you're the white people." And I look at him, I look at the room, I was like, I'm probably the darkest person in this room at the moment, but you just called me white privilege, who's oppressing the brown and that's the maybe the funny, yeah, the funniest thing about it, that people doesn't really understand the Israeli story. They doesn't understand what happened here, and they try to use the tools that they have from understanding the maybe the American story or the European story or the Australian, etc. They try to use the tools that they have because no one ever tried to explain them differently, right? And in some point, I think the Palestinians, they understood, oh, how easy it is to put this narrative, the American Black Lives Matter, for that matters, on the Palestinian issues, and then we get the support, even though in many ways it has nothing to do with it. When people speak about apartheid in Israel, they don't really understand what apartheid is, right? Or they never visited Israel. They never saw that we have a Supreme Court justice who is Arab. We have Arab lecturers in the universities. If you go to a hospital, probably half of the doctors will be Arabs, and it goes everywhere in the parliament, in the government, and people doesn't know that. People doesn't know that because no one ever told them that, but they told them, oh, there is an apartheid in Israel, and that's what they listen to. And another thing I understood, by the way, but dealing with diplomacy, with the hasbara, with the advocacy, is even though in Israel we think that everybody hates us, majority of the world doesn't even care about what happens here. Those who do care, give it maybe give or take, I don't know, an hour a day even. And in this hour, they have a very narrow window to what happened in Israel. And instead of us understand that we need to control or to try to affect what they see through this window, we just neglected this window. So as I said before, we're going now into a very long journey of try to explain. Some of the people will try to convince, maybe to show them a bit different picture, but some of the people, I have to say, are lost. Okay, I think if I am a person in Israel, in the government, who think about the next 15 or 20 years future, I think someone needs to put together a plan. What do we do when those people who are now in the elite universities of the United States are going to be in a positions within the government, and with the knowledge, let's call it, they have today? And I think that in 15, 20 years from now, Israel is going to be a very, very uncomfortable place. I will even say a dangerous place.
I really agree with you. I also want to just jump on that and say that that narrative that Alon was asking about, research, both in academia and by government intelligence agency, has shown that the decolonialization discourse and imposing it and renewing it is one of the core tenets of Russian disinformation mechanisms. This is one of the biggest anti-Western waves going all across French-speaking Africa, is exactly this kind of resurgence of decolonialization discourse. So we've seen this discourse already weaponized in the past. And I think that's what makes the Israeli case so sad, because in this case, we actually do have facts on our side. As Alon said, we're not a colonial state in just the most basic rudimentary sense of what a colony actually means, right? So though we have facts on our side, this quite known weaponized discourse is being weaponized against us, which begs the question why and how. And I think it comes back to the very classic Israeli left-wing saying, which is the occupation corrupts. Because I think the gap between the facts that are on our side and people believing us, this moral majority that does actually exist and would be open to believing Israel, right, it doesn't believe us because we've spent the past 25, 30 years doing apologetics for an unjustified military occupation. And I think that's something that needs to be said very explicitly, because it is true. When you try to do hasbara for a military system that is non-democratic, it undermines your position over time. And when you decide that the most important thing your diplomatic apparatus needs to do is justify the occupation and not, for example, convince young Western people that you are part of the Western society and that you are a nation like all nations, and that your origin story is actually quite less violent than Australia's or America's, right? But they're not focusing on that. They're focusing on whitewashing the settlements, on fighting this, and then also saying if you don't support the settlements, you're not pro-Israel, which is what we've seen, which also helped lay the groundwork. So in that sense, we're also helping them in this sense. And it's a very important point. If you want to help Israel, and Haaretz has been saying this for years, you need to stop supporting the occupation. And that's true at a factual level. It's also true at a political level.
Okay. I'm looking for questions, but so far I don't hear them from the participants. So I'll sort of wrap up with one more of my own, and then you guys can have a closing statement. If you look at the most recent polls, and I received a National Harris poll from the United States, I don't think Europe would be quite this strong, but nonetheless, notwithstanding all of these anti-Israeli statements that we see, whatever, over 80% of the American public supports Israel's right to defend itself, believes that Hamas should be eliminated, et cetera, et cetera. That is not the case between people 18 and 24. That is an anomaly within that. But already by age 25 to 30, in that age cohort, you see there's already some sort of a return to the American consensus. And my question is, are we overestimating the impact of this, or should we look at the 18 and 24-year-olds as the future? In other words, conventional media, the usual networks where people get their information, which apparently are less relevant to young people who do get the information from social media. And so how does the future look? And is this division that we see in the chronicle age of the respondents something that we need to be thinking about for the future? So I'll let Tomer start and then go back to you, Omer, and then we'll let you guys give a few minutes to wrap up your perspective on these issues.
So that's actually a continuous question to what I said before. I think we should look at this and we should be very afraid, honestly. And we should start thinking, what can we do in order to reach some of those people? And what can we do in order to reach the next generation after them? And in a funny way, by the way, because this is something we didn't speak about during the last conversation. You spoke about the conventional or the classic media. I think one of the problems of people in Israel is the lack of understanding that what they see in television every night is not what an American youngster in their age seeing in his television, or in Great Britain or any other place in Europe. And a thing that I found, and only Omer as a journalist can talk about it when I finish, but somewhere between the year of 2009 and 2014, I think, Israeli audience stopped seeing in the media what happened in Gaza. I think in the Lebanon war, in Second Lebanon War in 2006, I was very aware of what the IDF is doing in Dahia and in Beirut, etc. Now I almost never see in the Israeli media what happens in Gaza, because they just don't show it to us. And therefore, Israelis don't understand that people, when they open CNN or BBC, they see totally different picture.
I agree
And
with that,
this,
but I do, one second, I just want to ask Tomer, there have been, I think for the first time that I know of an Israeli conflict, many journalists have been embedded with Israeli forces. Now, you might say that's not a objective reporting, but I've seen a lot of reports from Israeli military correspondents in all the different television networks. Ron Ben Yishai, you name it, even Nachum Barnea, I think, made it to, it was a senior journalist at Idiot, made it there. So I'm wondering whether, how you would characterize the coverage, because there has been some coverage there. You're saying it just doesn't represent the actual war.
no, we'll say that all of the journalists you just mentioned, when they go into Gaza, they usually join the troops, and they will give you heroism stories of the troops. They will not, almost never show you, maybe Haaretz, by the way, is doing a good job in that, but unfortunately, maybe 3% of Israeli are reading Haaretz. Omer, I'm sorry. But this is, I think, this is maybe standing in the basic of the lack of understanding why young people in the States or in Europe see things differently than in Israel. And this is something we need to understand. They see a different picture. It's not only because they hate us or something, they see a different picture. And going back to your question, we need to find a way to show him the picture that we see. We need to find a way to explain them in the tools, by the way, that they will understand. Okay, so go more and more into the TikTok or YouTube, or I don't know. I'm almost 40 now, so I'm probably don't know some of those new social networks. But you have to go into those places and you have to find your way into them. And unfortunately, as strong as the civic society in Israel, you need to find a way to do it with governmental money, because this is have to be something big. Otherwise, it won't help you to be the strongest military in the Middle East, because you won't have the support of the world in 10 or 15 years from now, because those people are going to be the next ministers, the next mayors, the next presidents of their countries. And in a way, if there's something good happened for this horrible massacre, is the wake-up call to Israel also in this field.
Omer, what say you?
Yeah. So I think you're spot on in terms of this is exactly the schism. So Israelis, I think Tomer is spot on. There's very little of coverage of Gaza. It's almost a societal decision that we don't want to see. Haaretz has worked very hard to try to get footage from Gaza. It's very hard. There's also no reporters in Gaza from any side. So during Hamas rule, there's zero free press in Gaza. In that sense, the fact that the IDF is embedding journalists is good, but it's still it's part of a much wider issue that this entire part of the world is not independently covered. And I think this feeds into this wider divide that is also being fueled by algorithms. When I go on twitter.com and when you go on twitter.com, we see two different realities. And I think October 7th, we've seen, that's what I was saying before, this shift from echo chambers to iron lungs. We live in different worlds. For the Israelis, October 7th is happening again and again. For the rest of the world, we're slaughtering people in Gaza, and Israelis don't necessarily see that. And the world, the same way the world can identify with our experience. And I think the question is, how do we bridge those gaps? And I think when you think about how that's actually solved, you have to find alliances and shareholders. And a lot of what stakeholders, a lot of what I'm trying to do in Israel is not just work alone, but find people like Tomer, help nonprofits. Israel has an amazing NGO called Fake Reporter that does disinformation watching and is independent. And there's the Internet Association, which I've recently linked up with and I'm trying to empower. And I think people like Tomer, and I think in that sense, you need a very broad tent of people who are kind of committed to facts. I want to say a philosophical point about TikTok, which I've been thinking about recently, and I think underscores how big the problem is. Not only are algos creating silos, and we're all in this silo kind of world, the actual content is more and more disconnected. So on Twitter, at least you have a link, right? At least just someone saying, this is what I read here. On TikTok, you're already seeing an abstraction. It's someone telling you what they read on a different website. So we're constantly moving farther away from the source. And in that sense, also as someone who believes in academia and who believes in education, we have to return to the sources in a real way. Like people need to click links and people need to read and people need information. In that sense, I think there's still a classic Enlightenment project of empowering people, making knowledge and information accessible, and encouraging people to engage with that in a real complex way. I genuinely think there is no solution beyond that.
Well, before we close the session, the Stanford Israel Studies programs would like to thank the distinguished speakers. Really, a big shout out to Tomer Naor and Omer Ben Jacob, who have spent their late evenings and are getting to bed late, perhaps because of their commitment there. There will be additional webinars planned, and if you want to follow us, I would suggest you go into the chat where you can have the link to the Israel, but look up Israel Studies on Stanford. I certainly would like to end by echoing this call for critical thinking. There's no better place in the academy, and Stanford University certainly being one, is a place which really does take seriously this notion of documentation and providing, and it's quite almost the great paradox of our age that there's more information than ever. We could be very, very good at telling the truth, but somehow we're failing. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and thinking about how we can do this better. Let's all hope for a happier and more peaceful few days ahead of us. We should bring the hostages home, and we should live in a world where truth is heard throughout the land. Signing off from Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and from Stanford University.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you all. Good night. Lev Tov.